The Peter Schiff Show.
I want to actually talk about the 100-year anniversary. And maybe anniversary is not a good word because, that's, you celebrate something when you refer to an anniversary. And so this is nothing that we would want to celebrate. It's just we've had to endure this for 100 years. And that is the Jones Act, right? The Jones Act was passed 100 years ago today. And I tweeted about it earlier today. And it reminded me of, a quote, or I paraphrased Winston Churchill, because probably never in all of history has a law that benefited so few been in existence so long, yet negatively impacted so many. So many Americans are worse off as a result of the Jones Act. And there's a very small group who are better off, yet the Jones Act has endured for 100 years because of politics. And this is why the founding fathers were so, worried about democracy. And they called them factions, and they were worried about exactly what's happened. Because the problem politically with the Jones Acts is that everybody suffers a little bit. I mean, some Americans suffer more than others, people living in Puerto Rico, like I am, or people that live in Hawaii, or people that live in Alaska. They suffer more from the Jones Act than people that live in other states. But certainly anybody who lives on the eastern or western seaboards, they're suffering. The whole country suffers to some extent. But nobody really knows that their suffering is due to the Jones Act. And they don't really know how much it is, because all the Jones Act does is it increases shipping costs, right? Which, and everything that we consume has to be shipped somewhere. Either it's shipped to us in a finished form, or a lot of the raw materials get shipped around. And so everything we buy costs a little bit more money because shipping costs have been artificially inflated by the Jones Act. Now, who benefits? Well, you have a very small number of people in the shipping industry, which is a tiny industry, which I'm going to get into, but they have an enormous benefit. And the benefits are very clear. And so they are politically motivated to make sure that those benefits continue. And so, they have the lobbying to make sure that the Jones Act is there. Whereas the broader population, they don't really come together on this issue, because for any one person, the issue is not important enough for it to matter. But for the people who benefit, it's all they care about. Right? And if you go back to why we had a Jones Act, right? This was 1920 that it was enacted. And the supposed impetus for this was to make sure that we had a good merchant marine in case we're in a war, right? That we needed the vessels to supply our troops, or maybe even to take these ships that were commercial ships, and maybe we could use them in the military, right? We could use them in the war. We could call them into service somehow. And so in order to be safer, right, we wanted to have a big, viable merchant marine during peacetime in case we needed them during wartime, because, we didn't want to be beholden to foreigners, right? I mean, what if there was a blockade? I mean, we wouldn't want to be vulnerable to depend on having to use foreign ships. So the idea is, hey, let's try to protect our industry from foreign competition so that we'll have a bigger, more vibrant industry just in case we need it, right? So when they passed the Jones Act, there's three key provisions of the Jones Act, right? The ships have to be owned by American companies. They have to be built in America, right, with American workers building the ships. And then they have to be crewed by Americans. So there are three important things that the ship these criteria need to be met before it's allowed to transport any commercial cargo between two U.S. ports, right? So if you're going to pick up cargo in New York and drop it off in Florida, you got to do that on a Jones Act ship, right? So that's the deal. So anyway, this law has been in effect for 100 years. And what has the effect been? The U.S. shipping industry is virtually non-existent, right? We only have, in America, 98 ships, actual ocean ships, right? The way they're defined, it's you can carry 1,000 tons in the ocean. We only have 98 of them. There are over 53,000. I got the number here, 53,732. I mean, maybe it's more by now, but almost 54,000 ships. America has 98. We have less than 1/5 of 1% of the ships. That's it. We build in this country, our shipping industry, we build about 2 to 3 ships per year, right? That's all we do. China builds 4,000 ships a year. 4,000. We build 2 to 3. Korea builds 2,300. And I'm not talking about boats because they have other things that they build. I'm talking about these big ships on the ocean. Korea builds 2,300 a year. Japan builds 1,600 ships, right? So those are real industries, building ships. I mean, we do it for a hobby, 2 to 3 ships. Turkey builds 330 ships per year. Vietnam, 327 ships per year. America, 2, 3 ships. That's the industry that we're protecting. It's ridiculous. We got 98 ships. And, back in the year 2000, we had 193. We have fewer ships. We're destroying the ships because, they become obsolete and they get scrapped. We're not even building enough ships to replace the ships that are scrapped. Back in 1980, we had 250 ships. The industry is dying. And it's the Jones Act that's killing it, right? The government said we're going to protect the shipping industry, and they destroyed the shipping industry. In Europe, right, 40% of all the merchandise that is delivered by ships. 40%. In America, ocean liners, ships in the ocean rather, 2%. 2%, that's it. That's all the cargo that moves in the U.S. by water, by ship. Now, if you include the rivers, right? We have these big rivers and there's barges and stuff going down there. Yeah, then it's about 6%. But if you just look at ships, it's 2%. Oh, and by the way, I meant to mention that you'll read a lot about, that when all the propaganda, the pro-Jones Act propaganda, they'll say that there's 40,000 ships in the United States, not 98. Yeah, there's 40,000 if you count all these little teeny ships. More than half of those, like 65% of those 40,000 are barges that are on the rivers, with hauling garbage and stuff like that. And then you got a bunch of little tugboats in those numbers. So I'm talking about real big ships on the ocean, right? That's the ones that we barely have any of. And so we're not using ships. And this is how it works. So let's say a ship comes over and it has merchandise from Europe, and it drops it off at a port in New York, right? It can only pick up merchandise in New York if it's destined to go to another foreign country. It can't pick something up in New York and bring it down to Washington or bring it down to North Carolina or bring it down to Florida. Even if it's going down to those ports anyway to drop off stuff, it can't pick up any additional cargo and drop it back off. So that means an American who has stuff he wants to ship down south can't put it on that boat, even though there's empty space. So he's got to hire a truck or he's got to put it on a train. And, the most energy efficient, right? If you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint, the most energy efficient way to ship stuff is on a boat, on a ship, especially if the ship is going to go between ports anyway and it's got empty space. You might as well load more cargo on it. It's not going to take any extra energy. It's not going to have any extra emissions if you put more stuff in there. But the U.S. government will not allow any more stuff to be put in there. So as a result of this, everything costs more. If you want to ship oil from the Gulf of Mexico to New England, right, it costs about $6 a barrel. To ship it to Canada, which is further north, right? So it's more. It's a longer trip. It only costs $2. So it's 3 times as expensive to ship stuff from the Gulf of Mexico to New England than it is to ship it all the way north to Canada. And so obviously this is hurting American industry. And, a lot of times Americans are forced to buy products from foreigners. as opposed to Americans because it's cheaper to get stuff from foreign sources. That happens all the time in Alaska and Hawaii and in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, we buy rice in Puerto Rico. We buy rice from China, right? Why are we buying Chinese rice? I mean, we do have some rice in the United States, but the reality is it's cheaper to bring the rice all the way over here from China than it is to bring it from the United States. This is another example of this. So this is, I think it was last year. Puerto Rico wanted to import some liquid natural gas. And they wanted to import it from the United States because we had a lot of natural gas, the prices were low. And Puerto Rico, PREBA, which is the power company here, a lot of the power is generated based on natural gas. And so we need the natural gas to power the grid. And so Puerto Rico wanted to buy the natural gas from the United States. The problem was there was no way to get it here because we don't even have a Jones Act vessel that is capable of carrying liquid natural gas. They don't exist, right? So it's impossible. If you want to buy natural gas from the United States, it's impossible to bring it to Puerto Rico. Now, there are, I forget, maybe 400 or 500 of these ships in the world that can do it. They're just not American ships because, it costs, 6 times as much, 7 times as much to build a ship in America as it does to build it someplace else. So none of these ships are built here. So none of them are Jones Act compliant. So Puerto Rico was trying to get a waiver because it wanted to buy this American natural gas, which would have benefited the U.S. company that was selling it. And it would have benefited Puerto Ricans because it was a good price, right? So we wanted President Trump to sign a waiver, just a one-time waiver that said, hey, you're allowed to buy this natural gas from an American business. We will give you a waiver so that you can put that natural gas on a foreign ship because there are no American ships that even exist that could do it. So obviously granting the waiver, right, would not cost any American jobs. In fact, it would help create some American jobs because now we would be buying American gas. Well, anyway, so Trump was about to sign this bill. And last minute, he got bombarded with lobbyists, right? In particular, 2 Republican senators from Alaska came up, right? Alaska is one of the states that is most hurt by the Jones Act, right? Because you can't transport anything to and from Alaska and California, for example, because of the Jones Act, right? So they have to take things on rail, or they have to use trucks to go through Canada to get to America, or they got to put stuff on airplanes. We actually put live cattle on airplanes because we can't put them on boats, which would be a lot more efficient. I mean, we're spending a lot of money. It's ironic that the legislation was supposed to help the shipping industry, but by destroying the shipping industry, well, maybe it helped the trucking industry because now a lot of stuff that would have gone by ship goes by truck instead. But you would think that Alaska would be against the Jones Act, or Hawaii would be against the Jones Act, right? Because they're an island, right? Everything is coming by ship. Everything in Hawaii is more expensive because of the Jones Act, right? And there's no shipping in. They're not building ships down there, right? So, I mean, everybody's cost of living is higher because of the Jones Act, particularly in Hawaii and Alaska, right? Puerto Rico, we don't have any senators. We don't have any congressmen. So we're not involved in the discussions, right? But you've got congressmen and senators in Alaska and Puerto Rico. So why are they such strong supporters of the Jones Act? In fact, the strongest advocates for the Jones Act, other than places like Louisiana, let's say, where they do have a shipbuilding industry, right, are the states that you would think that would be the most wanting to get rid of it, the states that are suffering the most from the Jones Act requirement. But no, it's the senators in Alaska and Hawaii that are the strongest supporters of the Jones Act. And at first that would be counterintuitive. It's like, why would that be? Those should be the guys that want to get rid of it. Except the shipping lobby knows this, right? The shipping lobby knows that, hey, Alaska should really want to get rid of the Jones Act because they're really disproportionately suffering. The same thing in Hawaii. So what happens is the lobbyists want to really give a lot of money to the senators in those states, basically to be in favor of the Jones Act, because they know that without that money, they're going to be against the Jones Act. So they're basically bribing these senators, right, to sell out their own constituents, right, to do something that harms their own constituents just to get campaign contributions, which is what's going on. And I'm sure the lobbyists also say, if you do not support the Jones Act, if you say anything negative about the Jones Act, which is hurting your own people, not only are we not going to give you any money, we're going to fund your opponent. We're going to find somebody else who is in favor of the Jones Act, and we're going to fund their campaign, and they're going to beat you, right? And so you're going to be out of office. And so that's why where the stakes are the highest, right? The states that suffer the most, that's where the Senate is most in favor of keeping it. So what happened was, when word was out that Trump was going to grant this waiver, it was the Alaskan senators. They came in, these two Republicans. And it's ironic. It's Lisa Murkowski is one of them. And Lisa Murkowski just recently came out and says she doesn't even think she can support Trump, right? She doesn't think he should be reelected. And that infuriated Trump. And Trump was out there saying, well, I know where I'm going to be in 2 years. I'm going to come to Washington. I'm going to campaign against you. Anybody with a pulse, just announce you're running. I'll endorse you, right? He's really pissed at Lisa Murkowski. Meanwhile, he basically backstabbed Puerto Rico. He sold out Puerto Rico to appease her, because she was like, hey, my backers, right? I have these big donors that want to keep the Jones Act. And the thing is, the waiver wouldn't have done anything, right? But the Jones Act lobbyists, what they're afraid of is the camel's nose under the tent. Even though this one-time waiver would not have, done anything to harm the profits of the Jones Act businesses, because Puerto Rico is not going to use a U.S. ship, because it's impossible, because the ship isn't there, right? So this one waiver would have done nothing, right, to diminish the profits of the industry. But what they were afraid of is the precedent of the camel's nose under the tent. Hey, where there's one waiver, there's another waiver, and then another waiver, and then another waiver. So they had to shut it down. They had to nip it in the bud. And so even though President Trump was initially ready to sign the waiver, he ended up not doing it. And so then Puerto Rico ended up buying the liquid natural gas from Russia, and was able to come here on a foreign ship. So because of the Jones Act, Puerto Rico was forced to buy its natural gas from Russia instead of from the United States. And in fact, a lot of American businesses end up selling their products internationally, or rather, a lot of American business end up buying products from foreign companies rather than American companies, because it's cheaper to bring the stuff across the Atlantic or the Pacific than to just run it up the coast, because of the high cost of using a Jones Act ship. So it's not just higher transportation costs. All American industry, the entire country, has been rendered less productive as a result of the Jones Act. Also, a dying industry that barely exists can hold on to some monopoly profits, right? And in fact, some of these guys, Jones Act companies, were actually convicted of price fixing or racketeering with Puerto Rico. And some of these guys went to jail, and they had to pay big fines because they were rigging the market and fixing prices and really screwing Puerto Rico even more than they were screwed anyway. The whole industry is corrupt, and we need to get rid of the Jones Act, especially since the very purpose of the Jones Act, right? Because we might need the merchant marine in times of war. First of all, times have changed in the last 100 years. I mean, 100 years ago, we didn't even have an Air Force, let alone a Space Force. I mean, we don't need the merchant marine for the next war. And in fact, go back to the Gulf War, right? In the Gulf War, we had to supply all of the troops that we had in Iraq and in the Middle East, right? And there were no American ships. We had to rely almost 100%. Maybe we had one U.S. ship out of the whole, how many we used? 177, I think was the number I read. 177 foreign ships were used to help bring supplies to support our troops in the Gulf War, right? So the reason we had a Jones Act was to make sure in times of war, we had a merchant marine that we could rely on. And then we had a war and we had no merchant marine, because the very protectionist legislation that was meant to make us have a vibrant shipbuilding industry is what destroyed the shipbuilding industry, because it was no longer globally competitive. It was protected from the competition that would have kept it vibrant. And our whole ability to have a shipping industry was destroyed because of this legislation. So I don't know, what it's going to take to ever get rid of it, because as I said, you've got this powerful lobby out there that is bribing the very senators and congressmen that should be most in favor of getting rid of it. And those are the ones that are getting paid to want to promote it and save it. And then, of course, you also have the idea that, hey, it does protect some union jobs. And so there's some camaraderie, right? All the labor unions kind of stick together. And it's like, hey, we need to support our brethren here in the shipbuilders union. And so they kind of all come together, even though organized labor doesn't realize that they're barely protecting any jobs. The number of jobs that are being saved in the shipping industry, right, is tiny compared to the jobs that are being destroyed because we have the Jones Act. If we had a more competitive economy, right, if we didn't have to use these Jones Act ships, then a lot more jobs would be created in other areas. See, this is an example of the seen and the unseen, right? We see the bogus jobs that we have because of the Jones Act. At least we think we do, because right now, obviously, if we eliminate the Jones Act, I mean, these Jones Act ships, of course, would collapse in value. And, and probably there would be a lot of job losses because our industry had been protected for so long, it just can't survive anymore. So there would be these job losses. I think we'd have a lot more people working in shipping had we never had this protectionist legislation for the last 100 years. But because we've destroyed our industry with 100 years of protectionism, it's very vulnerable. So if we got rid of the Jones Act, yes, there would be an immediate loss of some jobs. But then there would be massive jobs gained in other industries that are now much more competitive. And because they're more competitive, they can expand and they can hire more people. In fact, what we can't see right now are all the people who are not employed because the Jones Act has destroyed their employment opportunities. So we don't see that. We see the jobs that the Jones Act creates or protects, but we don't see the far more numerous jobs that the Jones Act has prevented from coming into existence or has outright destroyed.